We are facing the reality that the climate is changing. There's no way that even if we put the brakes on now, that it's going to shift back to something that we may have thought of as our normal climate. It's not so much that we have longer intervals between rain necessarily, as much as it seems like it's hotter and the existing soil moisture evaporates and the plants transpire it more. I can remember 20 years ago, it seemed like we had thunder showers that we'd get 3/4 of an inch or an inch now and then, but we had strings of years in the last decade where we have lots of rainfall episodes that might be 1.5 to 2.5 inches, and we might see a couple of those in a week. Since I started here in 1993, we have had a lot of seasonal flooding. We have some fields that are underwater in the spring months, typically 1 year out of every 2. That's not at all unusual. On the silty soils, we've really tried to figure out what can we do in order to prevent that from being a disaster. So we've moved to more raised beds, particularly things that are prone to root diseases, like some of the cucurbits. We do a lot of those on raised beds with plastic mulch. Phytophthora has been a problem in low spots for us, so the raised beds, I think, are helping us avoid some of the worst of that. Likewise, we've started putting fewer of our long season critical storage crops into some of those more flood prone areas. So now we try to reduce the impact or mitigate the negative impact by putting more of those in sandier fields and less of them in those siltier fields, and having things that turn over more quickly, things that we can spare the loss of a couple of lettuce crops or salad mix crops or spinach crops. And then, if we need to, we can turn around and replant. We have been building our irrigation system for almost 20 years, and I can't imagine growing vegetables on sandy ground in a warm place like the Champlain Valley without irrigation. It's, for us, absolutely critical to maintain crop quality and growth for a lot of our crops. We're fortunate in being in the floodplain that we have an abundant water supply with a main stem river and also some large high-capacity wells in the floodplain. We use a lot of sprinkler irrigation in our main sandy field. We tend to use drip where we have plants that don't want water on the leaves or that are spaced far apart, so we can get some real weed control benefits and some water efficiency benefits by not watering the whole area. Things like winter squash or things on black plastic like melons, cucumbers, sweet potatoes, peppers, and so forth. There's also some cooling benefits that we will definitely run irrigation sometimes on a hot day with cool loving crops, just to make sure, even if we're not watering them a lot, to keep them a little bit cooler, things like greens and brassicas. And I think it's hard to get things to germinate in sandy soil without top water. We really depend on green manures for a lot of our organic matter management. That organic matter is a key element in our overall soil and crop fertility. We really depend on being able to mobilize that organic matter. And in a sandy soil like ours, we really do get a lot of nitrogen release out of that organic matter. We use a lot of winter rye. It's a great plant because we can put it in the ground anytime from the beginning of September up through about the 3rd week of October. Typically start off, if we're seeding it early-ish in September, we would be seeding it at maybe 2 bushels, around 100 pounds to the acre, unless we're pairing it with hairy vetch, which we like a lot as well. And then we might do 50 pounds of rye and 25 pounds of vetch. We also do a lot with oats, because there are certainly crops that we don't want to be fighting a vigorous growing residue in the spring, or we don't have time to let the tillage take effect on the rye. So we like to come in with a winter-killed cover crop. So we'll use oats, sometimes we'll use peas and oats. Usually those we'd be planting, those two crops we'd be planting sometime in the month of August. And typically we'd plant oats if we're clear seeding them at around 100 pounds to the acre. Oats and peas, we do roughly 50, 75 pounds of each in a mixture. And they give it up at around 17, 15 degrees. So last winter, in 2015, we still had green oats into January. It was the craziest thing because it was such a mild November, December period. And I thought, are these going to overwinter? Is this going to be the year that the oats are a problem in the spring? So one of the things about using all the green manures and cover crops and trying to integrate things like winter rye into our cropping system has been that we have to have sufficient equipment in order to handle those bulky residues. And in as much as we're trying to grow as much of our organic matter for our soil humus as possible, we really, if we're looking at something that's got a 6, 8, 10,000 pounds of dry matter per acre yield, in order to effectively incorporate that into the soil and build soil structure, we have had to figure out how we can do that and then still be able to plant vegetables in a timely fashion. Lower residue things, we typically will use a chisel plow and go through first thing in the spring and chisel those up, and then follow that up with a bed width disc harrow. For the higher residue crops, we've gone to a reciprocating spader. And the idea is they'll bury the residue effectively, but they don't invert the soil the way a moldboard plow does. So our initial pass through the field is very slow to incorporate these heavy residues, but we do a much more thorough job of incorporation, and so we don't have to do as much follow-up secondary tillage as a result. One of the key crops for our CSA members has always been tomatoes, and growing outdoor tomatoes in Vermont is kind of tricky. First of all, the season's pretty short in terms of when you can start harvesting them, because you can only put the plants out so early, or else you're going to risk some damage from potential late frosts. And secondly, there's a lot of foliar diseases that can plague tomatoes and create real problems. You can really get around almost all of the disease problems, and you can easily double the length of your tomato season, as well as improving your quality and your yield by moving things inside. We use them for most of our sort of high-value warm weather crops like tomatoes, peppers, but we also use them a lot in the winter. And even without heat, we can produce baby lettuce, spinach, things like that throughout the winter in those tunnels with just a little bit of protection. And that's really allowed us to concentrate our resources and our efforts on a small area where we can really optimize the fertility, optimize the water management, optimize the growing conditions. So we are facing the reality that the climate is changing, and there's no way that even if we put the brakes on now, that it's going to shift back to something that we may have thought of as our normal climate.